Brienne of Tarth is not canonically queer, and yet, if you ask queer women which Game of Thrones character they saw themselves in, Brienne comes up again and again. And I don't think that's accidental, because Brienne's story isn't really about who she falls in love with. It's about what happens when a woman grows up understanding she doesn't perform womanhood correctly. She's too tall, too strong, too masculine, too awkward, and not desirable in any way that the women in Westeros are supposed to be. And from the moment we meet her, Brienne seems painfully aware that the world has already decided what kind of woman she's allowed to be. And for a lot of queer women, we know that feeling. And that's why I think Brienne of Tarth is one of the strongest queer readings in Game of Thrones, even if the character herself was never written as queer. Think about being a high-born woman in Westeros, and what is that supposed to look like? You're supposed to be beautiful, graceful, marry well, produce heirs, and exist within this incredibly rigid system where femininity is basically a job description. And Brienne doesn't fit any of that at all. But what's interesting is that she doesn't simply reject femininity because she thinks it's weak. Brienne actually seems deeply hurt by her inability to access the version of femininity everyone tells her she should want. She remembers being mocked and remembers boys pretending to court her, and she knows she's considered ugly, and she knows people laugh when they call her Brienne the Beauty. And that nickname is cruel specifically because it tells her that you're trying to be a woman and everyone can see that you're doing it wrong. Tell me queer women haven't heard some version of that were too masculine or too loud or intimidating or not feminine enough. Or alternatively, you are feminine, but in the wrong way. There is constantly somebody waiting to tell queer women that our relationship with womanhood isn't right. And Brienne lives inside of that discomfort as well. And this is where I think Brienne becomes even more interesting, because she doesn't want to be a man. And that would be an easy interpretation, that Brienne wears armour and fights with swords, so she must want to be a man. But she doesn't. That's never the point. Brienne knows she's a woman, and she doesn't seem interested in abandoning that identity. What she wants is access to something women are forbidden from having: a knighthood, agency, honour on her own terms, allowing herself to fight in combat. What she is actually saying is, why does being a woman mean I can't be these things? Because historically, queer women have had to negotiate that exact question. Why does loving another woman make me less of a woman? Why does having short hair make me less of a woman? Why does wearing men's clothing make me less of a woman? Why does being masculine make me less of a woman? Why do I have to prove my femininity to anybody? Brienne's existence quietly exposes how artificial rules are. She's not bad at being a woman. She's bad at being a woman Westeros decided that she needs to be. And those are two completely different things. Now, I want to talk specifically about masculine queer women here, because masc women have spent decades being treated strangely by the media. Sometimes they're the butt of the joke. Sometimes they're villains. Sometimes they're portrayed as predatory. Sometimes they're treated as failed versions of femininity who secretly just need a makeover. Brienne could have so easily become that type of character because of how she is. She's huge in stature, physically powerful, wears armour. Socially, she's uncomfortable, and other characters openly question her womanhood. But the story doesn't turn around and say that actually Brienne just needs a dress and a man to tell her that she's beautiful. Her masculinity is not something that she grows out of. It's a part of her, and she gets to remain Brienne. And that is incredibly important, because masculine women rarely get fantasy characters who are allowed to be heroic without having their gender presentation corrected first. Brienne doesn't become powerful by being more feminine. She's powerful because she's Brienne. And then there's Jaime. Now, I know some of you are thinking, Sappho, Brienne is literally in love with Jaime. And yes, again, this is a queer reading. It's not me claiming that Brienne is secretly canonically gay. Even Brienne's relationship with Jaime actually strengthens the reading for me. Because what does Jaime give Brienne that she desperately wants? Recognition. He sees her for her, not as a joke or a failed woman or Brienne the beauty. He sees her as a warrior, and he respects her ability and trusts her. And most importantly, he eventually validates the identity that the entire world has denied her. He knights her. That scene hits incredibly hard when you look at Brienne through a queer lens, because it isn't really about romance. It's about somebody finally looking at the thing you've always known yourself to be and saying that, yes, I see it too. So when Jaime tells her to kneel and makes Brienne a knight, she cries. Of course she does. She spent her entire life being told that this identity isn't available to her, and suddenly somebody she looks up to says it is, and that you're worthy of recognition. And that kind of recognition, well, queer people know the feeling. There's also another part of Brienne I think queer audiences immediately recognise. She can't just exist. Her body becomes a conversation. People comment on her height, her strength, her clothing, her sexuality, whether she really is a woman, or if anyone could possibly want her. If she walks into a room, well, people have already decided what her body means, and that is an incredibly queer experience. Because queer people, particularly gender non-conforming queer people, understand what it's like for strangers to read your identity before you've even opened your mouth. People look at the way you dress, the way you walk, your hair, your voice, who you're standing beside. Suddenly they've constructed an entire story about you. Brienne doesn't get the luxury of neutrality. That's important, because neither do a lot of queer women. And this might be a part of Brienne that gets me the most. It's that underneath all of her armour, literally, there's somebody incredibly vulnerable. She wants honour and respect, but she also wants tenderness and love, because she spent her entire life being mocked, and she's learned to expect humiliation instead. Remember the story about the men at Renly's camp making bets over who could take her virginity? Brienne thinks people expressing attraction to her might be a joke, because historically it has been. So when genuine intimacy finally appears, there's this heartbreaking uncertainty underneath it all. Can someone really want me? Not despite what I am, but as I am? And I think that's another reason queer women attach themselves to Brienne, because so many of us grew up believing that the thing making us different also made us undesirable, especially if you didn't embody conventional femininity. If you were the tall girl, the strong girl, the tomboy. If you were the girl everyone assumed was gay before you even figured it out yourself. Well, Brienne speaks to that insecurity without the story ever needing it to be about queerness. And this brings me back to the scene I think defines Brienne, her knighting. Because Brienne spends years trying to earn something she technically isn't allowed to have, because she's already behaving like a knight, and she's probably more honourable than most of the actual knights in Westeros. She keeps her oaths and protects people. She embodies what the ideal of it is. But the title is withheld. And why? Because she's a woman. Does that sound familiar? Sometimes marginalised people spend their entire lives being told, you can do everything right, you can be everything you're supposed to be, and somebody can still decide that door isn't for you. So watching Brienne finally cross that line, it feels bigger than one character getting a title. It's a woman being told that the boundaries placed around her identity were never as real as everyone pretended that they were, and that smile on her face, that tiny, overwhelmed smile, that's the moment. That's why people love her so much. And so, is Brienne queer? Canonically, no. At least not in the story that we're given. But that's not the question I'm interested in, really. The more interesting question is this. Why have so many queer women looked at Brienne and recognised something? And I think the answer is because queer representation isn't always about sexuality. It's about alienation, gender, being told that the way you exist is wrong, building an identity outside the path you're given. And sometimes it's simply about watching a woman refuse to become smaller just to make everyone else more comfortable. Brienne isn't trying to destroy femininity. She's expanding on what a woman is allowed to be. And maybe that's why queer women have always looked at Brienne of Tarth and thought, yeah, we know this feeling. But I want to know what you think. Do you think Brienne has a genuine queer reading? Or do you think we're projecting modern queer experiences onto a character whose story is really about sexism and gender roles? And more importantly, what other supposedly straight female characters have queer women collectively looked at and gone, oh, she's like us? Because I already have a few names in mind. If you enjoyed this kind of queer character analysis, please hit subscribe because we're going to go much deeper into more women, ships, stories that queer audiences saw themselves in long before television was willing to say it out loud. And until next time, take care. Bye bye.